The chips are stacked neatly before you. The felt is soft beneath your hands, and the air in the room feels still, heavy with quiet calculation. Around the table, faces remain unreadable, only eyes flicking briefly toward one another. Somewhere, a ceiling fan hums. Cards whisper as they slide across the table, and in that small sound, a question already begins. What story will you tell this time? Welcome back to the Sleepy Card Dealer. Before we begin, if these kinds of calm, thoughtful poker sessions help you slow down and think clearer, consider subscribing. It really supports the channel and helps more players find their way to this table. Tonight, we're not talking about aggression, luck, or wild hero calls. We're exploring something quieter, something older and far more human: bluffing. The art of appearing strong when you're weak, of saying something without words. It's not just deception, it's storytelling through fear, patience, and control. A bluff, when done well, is not an act of trickery. It's an act of truth, disguised, reshaped, and delivered with stillness. At its heart, bluffing is about silence, the kind that fills the room when two players are staring each other down, both waiting for the other to blink first. It's about creating a version of the truth that others will believe because you believe it first. Every motion, every pause, every chip placed or withheld becomes part of that silent dialogue. But before we go deeper, it's important to clear the biggest misconception. Bluffing isn't about lying. Not really. It's not about pretending you're invincible. It's about understanding the story the table is telling and deciding where you fit within it. The best bluffs emerge not from desperation but from logic and rhythm. They come from seeing how the story could plausibly continue if your hand were real, and then playing that version with conviction. So tonight, we'll take our time. We'll explore the layers beneath the surface. The logic that makes a bluff believable, the timing that turns fear into power, and the silence that gives your story space to live. We'll move through how bluffs are built across each street, how professionals disguise intention, and how emotional balance becomes your greatest weapon. No charts, no math drills, no fancy jargon, just reasoning, awareness, and rhythm. Because bluffing isn't a formula, it's a language. And once you understand that language, you'll start to notice how it's spoken, not just at the poker table, but in everyday moments of pressure, persuasion, and restraint. Think about it. Every time you make a decision in uncertainty, when you act before knowing the outcome, you're bluffing in some form. Life, like poker, rewards those who can stay calm while others rush to reveal their hands too soon. At this table, we'll learn that bluffing is not about tricking others, but about understanding yourself well enough to project certainty even when you're unsure. It's about holding your posture when your pulse rises. It's about maintaining rhythm when logic tells you to panic. The calm player, the quiet one who moves slowly but decisively, often has the most dangerous weapon of all: control. And that's what we're here to build. Control over how you present yourself. Control over timing, silence, and the subtle cues that others unconsciously read. We'll unpack when to pull the trigger, when to wait, and when to let the story die on its own. You'll see how the greatest players bluff less often than you think, but when they do, it works because everything about it makes sense. As you listen, picture yourself at the table, not to win every pot, but to understand every moment. Imagine the feeling of stillness when you execute a perfect bluff, not shaking, not racing, but grounded in clarity. Because bluffing, when understood properly, is clarity. It's the alignment between logic, courage, and performance, and it begins long before the chips move forward. So take a breath, let the room grow quiet. The cards are waiting, and the truth, your truth, is about to meet the table. Every bluff begins with truth. That may sound paradoxical, but the entire structure of deception in poker depends on credibility. And credibility is built from honesty. You earn the right to bluff not by being unpredictable, but by being consistent. The players who fold when they should, bet when they should, and show up with value often enough are the ones who can sell a story when the time comes. Without that foundation, every bluff looks like noise. Bluffing works because of expectations. Every opponent at the table is constantly updating their internal picture of who you are, how you play certain spots, how you respond to pressure, how you handle big pots. That image becomes their truth. The moment you make a move that doesn't fit it, they hesitate. That hesitation is where your advantage lives. but that advantage only exists because you've given them a reason to believe in the story you've been telling up to that point. So the first principle of bluffing is credibility. You must look like someone who could have it. Your betting line, your timing, and even your composure must make sense within the hand's natural logic. A wild, reckless player can't bluff effectively because they've lost the narrative control. No one trusts their story. The calm player, the measured one, can bluff small and be believed big. The second principle is context. A bluff doesn't happen in isolation. It exists inside a hand structure, within the rhythms of position, range, and board texture. You can't just decide to bluff because you feel like it. The story has to be plausible. If the board pairs on the river and your line has been passive all the way through, it's hard to suddenly represent a monster. But if you've been setting up the rhythm, see betting a dry flop, continuing on the turn and letting the board evolve naturally, your final bet fits the pattern. The bluff feels like a continuation of truth, not a break from it. The third principle is risk symmetry. Bluffing is not about bravery, it's about ratio. A good bluff is one where the potential reward outweighs the danger in proportion to your opponent's tendencies. If you're betting into someone who never folds top pair, you're not bluffing, you're burning. But if you've noticed a pattern, a hesitation, a fear of pressure, then your bluff becomes less about your cards and more about their discomfort. Then there's frequency. Many intermediate players misunderstand bluffing as a high-wire act that must be performed often to stay balanced. But bluffing too frequently destroys the illusion. Your opponents stop giving credit, and every pot turns into a battle for survival. Instead, think of bluffing like seasoning. Too little, and your play becomes predictable. Too much, and it overwhelms everything else. The goal is harmony, bluffing just enough to keep your range open, to remind others that you're capable, but not chaotic. Here's an example of correct versus incorrect thinking. Imagine a simple hand. You raise pre-flop with king-queen suited from the cutoff. The big blind calls. The flop comes ace 8-4 rainbow. You miss completely. Many players in this spot fire a continuation bet automatically. They've learned to represent the ace. But if your opponent is the kind who never folds top pair, your story won't be believed. You're bluffing from emotion, not structure. Now, imagine you check back instead. The turn brings a 10, giving you a gut shot straight draw. When your opponent checks again, now you have both equity and opportunity. You bet, not just because of your draw, but because your delayed aggression fits a story. From your opponent's point of view, you could easily be slow playing an ace or probing after weakness. If the river bricks and you fire again, it looks credible. You've told a story that began with caution and evolved with logic. That's the foundation of a believable bluff. The narrative holds. Incorrect bluffing, on the other hand, usually stems from ego or impulse. A player feels entitled to win a hand simply because they've invested chips. They can't accept folding, so they bluff out of frustration, not because the situation supports it, but because their emotions demand control. This kind of bluff fails even before the chips leave their fingers, because the body betrays what the mind refuses to admit. The truth is, a good bluff feels calm. It doesn't come with adrenaline or fear. It comes with a quiet knowing, a logical recognition that the story fits, that your opponent's range is capped, that the risk is proportional. You breathe evenly, you move slowly, and you trust the reasoning behind the action. That's not luck. That's discipline. Another key element of bluffing's foundation is observation. Every hand you're not in teaches you something. How do people react when they're strong? Do they sit still or start moving more? Do they bet quickly or hesitate? Everyone gives something away, even if it's subtle. The best bluffs arise when you blend these observations with logic. If you've seen someone fold too easily in certain board textures, that's not random. It's a tell you can use later, when the conditions align. Finally, we arrive at balance. The strongest players build bluffs into their overall strategy naturally. They don't think of them as separate moves, but as part of the same spectrum as value bets. On the river, for instance, if they're betting their strong hand 60% of the time, they'll include a few missed draws in that same frequency. That balance makes them unreadable. No opponent can simply assume they're bluffing or value betting, if both are always possible. So the foundation of bluffing rests on 5 quiet pillars: credibility, context, risk symmetry, observation, and balance. Each one supports the others. Without them, a bluff collapses into hope. With them, it becomes an instrument, deliberate, precise, and powerful. Remember, the goal is not to bluff more, it's to bluff better. When you understand the logic, you'll find that bluffing less often, but in the right places, yields far greater results. The real skill isn't in tricking others, it's in aligning your story with their perception and knowing exactly when that story becomes too believable to ignore. And from that base of logic and awareness, the art begins to take form. Every bluff begins long before the bet hits the felt. It starts with the first decision, the cards you choose to play and the way you choose to enter the hand. The unfolding of a bluff mirrors the structure of a story, an opening scene, a rising action, a moment of truth and a resolution. To bluff well is to tell that story in rhythm with the cards, convincing your opponent that each chapter makes sense. Let's start at the beginning, pre-flop. Bluffing doesn't mean raising garbage. The seeds of a good bluff are planted in hands that have the potential to improve, or at least to connect with believable textures. Suited connectors, gappers, small pairs, and these hands carry flexibility. When you raise with them, you're not lying, you're implying future possibilities. The trick is in how you carry that implication through later streets. Suppose you open from the cutoff with Jack-10 suited. A solid opponent defends from the big blind. The flop comes a Queen-9-3 rainbow. You've picked up an open-ended straight draw. When your opponent checks, your continuation bet represents more than one thing. It could be a top pair, a set, or a draw. This is the kind of board where your story can breathe. The bet is logical, credible, and backed by potential. You're semi-bluffing, but it doesn't feel like one. That's the beauty of starting with hands that blend truth and threat. Now let's contrast that with a weak starting point. Imagine you raise with 9-4 offsuit because you want to mix it up. The flop comes Ace-King-7 and you decide to fire. Nothing in your pre-flop action supports the story. You're bluffing from emptiness. Even if the opponent folds, the action teaches nothing. There's no rhythm, no alignment between logic and risk. These bluffs don't build long-term respects, they build confusion, and mostly your own. As the hand unfolds to the flop and turn, the art of bluffing becomes less about the cards and more about story consistency. Every street must make sense in sequence. If your flop bet says, I have top pair, your turn bet must reinforce that, not contradict it. If the board texture changes, say a third spade falls or the straight completes, you must recognize whether your story still fits the new picture. Good bluffers are great editors. They know when to cut the story short. The turn in particular is where most players lose the thread. It's the moment of decision, the chapter where the bluff either evolves or ends. Too many players double barrel out of habit without asking whether the turn card supports the tale they're telling. They act as if momentum itself will carry the lie forward. But poker doesn't reward stubborn authorship. It rewards believable storytelling. Sometimes the best bluff dies quietly on the turn, folded back into patience. Other times, the turn strengthens the illusion and you press forward with clarity. Picture this. You raise from the button with King-9 suited. The big blind calls. The flop comes 10-7-2 with one of your suit. You continuation bet. The opponent calls. The turn brings a queen, giving you a gut shot and a backdoor flush draw. They check again. Now your second barrel has logic. You can represent strong top pairs, overpairs, or draws, turning real equity. The queen also hits your perceived range far more than theirs. When you bet, you're not forcing belief, you're guiding it. If they fold, it's not because they feared you, it's because your story became too coherent to challenge. Then comes the river, the silence before resolution. At this stage, emotion often clouds judgment. The pot has grown, chips feel heavier. You know your hand has nothing left to give, but your mind races. Should you fire again or give up? This is the final chapter of your narrative, and it demands honesty. Does the board, the sequence, and the timing of your actions still align with what you're pretending to hold? If not, the bluff will crumble under scrutiny. The best river bluffs are those that emerge naturally from previous streets. When your bets have built a story that makes sense, the river bet doesn't feel forced. It feels inevitable. You're not trying to bluff. You're simply finishing the thought. If you've shown restraint and logic all the way through, your opponent will feel it. They'll sense that the story is whole. and in poker the player who tells the most coherent story usually wins the pot, whether their hand exists or not. Now let's walk through one full hand, a bluff that unfolds in rhythm. You're playing $2 to $5 cash. You're on the button with 8-7 of hearts. 2 players limp. You raise to $25. Only the big blind calls. The flop comes king 5-6 with 1 heart. You have an open-ended straight draw. Your opponent checks. You continuation bet $30 into $55. They call. So far, the story says you could have a king, a strong pair, or a draw. The turn brings the ace of clubs. This card is powerful. It changes the dynamic. Your opponent checks again. Now, from their perspective, the ace is better for your range than theirs. You bet $85 into $115. The sizing is assertive but not desperate. It says you've improved. They tank, then call. The river is the 3 of spades. You miss your draw completely. Your heart beats harder, but your face stays calm. You look at the board. King, 5-6, ace, 3. Think about the story you've told. Pre-flop aggression from the button. Continuation bet on a coordinated flop. Double barrel when the ace hit. A classic value line representing top pair or better. Everything fits. You slide out $180 into the $285 pot. Your opponent sighs, looks at the cards again and folds. That's not luck. That's structure. You bluffed with alignment. Every step supported by logic. Each bet rooted in believable truth. The story was clear and clarity wins pots. But not every bluff ends in triumph. Sometimes you pull the trigger correctly and they still call. Sometimes they have the perfect bluff catcher. A hand too good to fold, too weak to raise. That's part of the rhythm. You can't control outcomes, only execution. A failed bluff that followed proper reasoning is not a mistake. It's a rehearsal in control. The error lies in the emotional aftermath, tilting, chasing, trying to get it back. When you understand the unfolding of a hand, bluffing stops feeling like a gamble and starts feeling like a craft. You're no longer throwing darts in the dark. You're constructing a narrative, one that moves from logic to conviction, from structure to silence. Each street asks for a new level of clarity. Pre-flop does setup, flop intention, turn conviction, and river honesty. At the end of it all, when the chips move toward you, you realize something subtle. The opponent didn't fold because they feared you. They folded because they believed you. They believed the story you told without a single word spoken. And that's the quiet beauty of bluffing. It's not about aggression, but persuasion. Not about forcing a fold, but earning it through coherence. Every bluff begins long before the river. The architecture of deception is built from the moment you choose which hands to play, because the hands you start with determine which stories you can tell later. Not every holding can support a bluff, just like not every foundation can hold a house. The strongest bluffs aren't born from impulse, they're built from structure. When you think about bluffing, think about representation. To represent strength believably, you must start with hands that could logically arrive at that strength by the end of the hand. That's the first layer of architecture, plausibility. If your pre-flop range never includes ace-king, you can't credibly tell the story of an ace-high board. If you never call with suited connectors, you can't pretend to have the straight when it appears. Balance in your starting hand selection isn't just about equity, it's about narrative options. Good players design their pre-flop ranges with this in mind. They include a mix of strong value hands, speculative draws, and occasional suited gappers or small pairs that allow for creative post-flop lines. Each of these categories supports a different kind of bluff later on. The suited connectors, for example, give you semi-bluff potential. Hands that can continue aggression while still holding paths to real improvement. The low pairs give you disguised strength when they hit sets, allowing you to mix incredible bluffs from the same positions. It's tempting to think of bluffing as playing bad hands aggressively, but that view collapses quickly under scrutiny. Real bluff architecture is about equity flow. When you raise pre-flop with a hand like 9-8 suited, you're not just speculating, you're building potential stories across multiple board types. You'll connect with straights, flushes, and middle pair textures that allow you to bet credibly when checked to. Your opponent can't easily categorize your range as weak. Contrast that with opening 10-3 offsuit. Even if you hit a piece, your story is brittle. The boards that favor you are rare, and when they appear, they often favor stronger versions in your opponent's range. Structurally, it's a hand that collapses under pressure. You can't represent anything meaningful because the foundation was never solid to begin with. Architecture also means ratio awareness. Bluffing frequency depends on how many value combinations you have. If, for instance, you reach the river on a board where you can credibly represent 3 strong hands, adding 1 or 2 bluff combinations keeps your play balanced. But if you start with too many weak hands, you'll end up over-bluffing. The structure becomes top-heavy. The best players think in terms of ratios, not emotions. They don't decide to bluff because they feel like it. They decide because the math of their range supports it. This is why disciplined pre-flop construction is such an underrated skill. When you play too many hands out of position, you enter too many pots that can't tell believable stories. You're forced to bluff from emptiness, and your narrative sounds false. When you tighten your range and build from logical starting points, every move later on becomes easier. The river decisions feel calmer because your earlier architecture supports them. To illustrate, imagine 2 players on the button. One opens nearly every hand, including junk. The other opens selectively as suited aces, broadways, pairs, suited connectors. On a board like King 10-5, the first player's continuation bet might look like noise. Everyone knows they miss this flop often. The second player's bet carries weight. Their range connects naturally with the texture. Same bet size, same motion, but completely different believability. Structure transforms the same action into different meaning. Pot odds and implied odds fit quietly into this conversation. The better your starting structure, the more you can use bluffing as a low-risk investment in information. Semi-bluffs, bets made with hands that can still improve, allow you to win 2 ways, by making your opponent fold or by catching up when called. This is efficient architecture. You're investing in future potential while representing current strength. When you choose hands with this dual nature, bluffing stops feeling like gambling and starts feeling like engineering. The next layer is protection. Your range must defend against exploitation. If you only bet strong hands, opponents will fold too much and never pay you off. If you bluff too often, they'll call you down. So you blend the two. Every strong action must contain both truth and lie. When you continuation bet the flop, include both top pairs and missed draws. When you raise the river, mix genuine monsters with rare but calculated air. The ratio depends on your opponent, but the principle is universal. A strong structure hides its beams. There's also timing in this design. Early in a session, when opponents don't yet know your tendencies, your bluffs rely more on logic than image. As the game evolves, your history becomes part of the architecture. If you've shown down the strong hands in similar lines, your future bluffs gain credibility. If you've been caught bluffing too often, your foundation weakens. Every revealed hand reshapes the blueprint. The architecture of bluffing is never static. It's an ongoing renovation. Ultimately, choosing the right starting hands for bluffing is less about deception and more about preparation. You're preparing to tell coherent stories across countless board textures. You're preparing to stay emotionally stable when the line you choose requires courage. You're preparing to look down at the river and realize with calm conviction that your story makes perfect sense, even if your cards don't. The architecture of a bluff is quiet, invisible work. It's the discipline of folding the wrong hands pre-flop, the awareness of range balance, and the willingness to design your play for the long term. Most players never reach this stage. They keep trying to build castles on sand. But when you start with structure, when you choose hands that can carry meaning, you stop chasing luck and start shaping outcomes through logic. That's what separates a guess from a plan, and a player from an artist. Bluffing in tournaments is a different kind of art. The structure of chips, blinds, and time changes the weight of every decision. Unlike in cash games, where stacks can be reloaded and the mistakes absorbed, every bluff in a tournament carries a quiet echo of finality. Each move presses against survival itself, and that tension transforms the psychology of deception. To bluff well here, you must learn to balance courage with preservation, to risk without recklessness, and to stay composed when pressure multiplies. Early in a tournament, the blinds are small, the stacks are deep, and time stretches ahead. Here, bluffing is about image building. You're planting seeds that will matter hours later. Your bluffs in this stage should be thoughtful, low-cost, and based on position and board texture rather than aggression. You want to appear calm and credible, someone who bets with reason, not impulse. If you overbluff early, you burn both chips and reputation. If you bluff selectively and show down strength often enough, You create a powerful baseline. When you bluff later, people believe you. Imagine sitting in level 2 of a major event. You've got 200 big blinds. You open from the cutoff with 9-8 suited. The big blind defends. The flop comes King 7-6 rainbow. You continuation bet small, representing a wide range of top pairs and draws. Your opponent folds. That's not about stealing. It's about rhythm. You showed willingness to bet when the story made sense, and you did it calmly. Later, when stacks are shallower, that same motion will carry authority because you established credibility when the stakes were low. As the tournament moves to its middle stages, the nature of bluffing evolves. Blinds increase, stacks shrink, and every pot begins to matter more. Here, timing replaces abundance. You can no longer afford every semi-bluff. You must choose spots that align with position, fold equity, and opponent psychology. Good tournament players understand that bluffing is not a constant pressure, it's a pulse. There are moments when the table is tight, nervous, trying to coast to the money. That's when your well-timed aggression carries maximum leverage. Fear does the work for you. Consider a mid-stage scenario. You're holding ace-jack offsuit with 35 big blinds. The cutoff opens, you 3-bet from the button. They call. The flop comes Queen 8-3 rainbow. You miss, but your pre-flop story remains strong. You continuation bet small, a reflection of your positional authority. They call again. The turn brings a 5. They check. You could barrel, but now your stuck-to-pot ratio is low and one mistake could cripple you. Here's where discipline replaces ego. The architecture of a good tournament bluff includes restraint. You check back, realizing that your image is more valuable than this pot. You've kept control of your rhythm without risking elimination. Late in tournaments, bluffing becomes a weapon of survival. Stack depths are shallow, blinds are fast, and every move affects not only your chips but your future pay jumps, what players call ICM pressure. This is the stage where fear becomes a currency. The threat of busting is more powerful than the chips themselves. Great players know how to project that fear outward, to make others feel it more acutely than they do. A well-timed shove, a confident glance, a deliberate pause before moving all in. These gestures speak in the language of finality. But this is also where most players overstep. They confuse bravery with chaos. They start bluffing out of desperation, mistaking tension for opportunity. The line between courage and recklessness becomes razor thin. The truth is, deep stage bluffing isn't about being fearless. It's about being comfortable with fear. You act despite it, not because you've erased it. When you move chips across the line knowing the risk, you do it with clarity, not adrenaline. In practical terms, late-stage bluffing should focus on leverage points. Identify who has the most to lose. Short stacks fear elimination. Big stacks fear confrontation with other big stacks. Medium stacks trapped in the middle often play too cautiously. That's where your pressure lands best. Bluffing isn't about attacking randomly. It's about aiming at the psychology of survival. There's another quiet layer here. Table image under fatigue. Deep in a tournament, everyone's tired. Mental energy wanes, focus blurs. A bluff at this point is less about technical precision and more about emotional control. Can you stay still while others unravel? Can you make a deliberate move without the tremor of exhaustion betraying you? Fatigue creates leaks, betting patterns, timing tells, micro-hesitations. If you remain calm while others lose rhythm, your bluffs will land with surprising frequency. Now picture a bubble situation. One player away from the money. Everyone tightens, protecting their min-cash dreams. You sit with a stack that can hurt people. You raise from the late position with 8-6 suited. The blinds hesitate. They know calling could cost them their tournament life. The cards barely matter now. The pressure does. You've weaponized silence and structure. Your bet represents composure under fear, and that's the one story no one wants to challenge on the bubble. Of course, not every tournament spot invites bluffing. Against short stacks in shove or fold territory, you lose the advantage of depth. The simplicity of their decisions makes deception less effective. You can't bluff someone who's already surrendered to variance. The true art lies in picking your targets, those still holding on to control, still trying to play perfect poker. Those are the minds you can influence. In the late stages, final table play adds yet another layer, ICM inversion. Suddenly, chip preservation outweighs chip accumulation for some players. If you understand who's climbing the pay ladder and who's playing to win, you can adjust your bluff frequency. Against those who fear falling, apply pressure. Against those already liberated by big stacks or short desperation, revert to patience. Every bluff should reflect both stack context and emotional context. Through all of this, one thing remains constant: the stillness behind your actions. The calm player in a late-stage tournament radiates strength. Their movements are slow, deliberate, unbothered. Opponents project meaning onto that silence. They fold not because they're certain you have it, but because they're certain you could. That's the highest compliment a bluff can earn, to be believable even when unseen. So remember, tournament bluffing is not about volume, it's about timing, leverage, and self-control. It's about telling smaller stories in louder rooms. The structure of blinds and fear narrows the canvas, but within that frame the painter's hand matters more than ever. The chips become brushstrokes, and every bluff, when executed with discipline, reveals not chaos, but mastery. Every player thinks they understand emotion, until it owns them. Bluffing doesn't just test logic, it tests the body's quiet reactions to stress. The pounding pulse, the dry mouth, the restless eyes. You can learn all the theory in the world, but when your heart races and the room feels too quiet, it's your nervous system, not your strategy, that determines how the hand ends. Emotional control in bluffing begins with self-awareness. You must first notice how your body responds to tension. Everyone has tells, but the most dangerous ones are internal: the tightening of breath, the loss of rhythm, the small collapse of focus when fear whispers, "You're about to get caught." You can't fake calmness. You can only build it through repetition, through learning that discomfort is not danger, that silence is not exposure, and that control is a practiced stillness, not a forced one. When players talk about being fearless, they usually misunderstand what real composure feels like. The best bluffers don't eliminate fear, they integrate it. They accept that anxiety will always surface before a big move. They let it exist, breathe, and pass through them without letting it steer the wheel. The fear becomes background noise, like the hum of a refrigerator, noticed but irrelevant. That's the true emotional balance of poker, acknowledging nerves without obeying them. Ego is another enemy. Ego demands to win every pot, to prove dominance, to correct every wrong with aggression. But bluffing is not about dominance, it's about persuasion. You're not forcing the opponent to fold, you're inviting them to believe. The moment your bluff becomes about personal validation, you've lost your center. The chips you risk start representing pride instead of probability. That's when the game punishes you. A clear mind sees context. It knows when the hand's story makes sense and when it doesn't. But an emotional mind is blind to narrative. It only sees opportunity or injustice. It says, "They can't keep having it," or "I deserve to win this one." Every impulsive bluff begins with a sentence like that. It's the whisper of frustration disguised as confidence. Let's pause on that word. Frustration. It's the most common reason good players unravel. A bad beat, a missed draw, a fold that would have won. These moments linger like static. And then comes the next hand, a chance to make it right. The urge to reclaim control feels irresistible. That's when the worst bluffs happen. Those born not from strategy, but from the ache of wanting things to feel fair again. The cure is humility. The discipline to say, "This isn't the moment." The courage to fold, breathe, and wait until clarity returns. The emotional side of bluffing also includes recovery. What you do after you've been caught. Because eventually you will be. Even the best storytellers get called down. The test isn't whether you can avoid exposure. It's whether you can stay composed afterward. Most players shrink when caught. They become defensive, overly cautious, or start talking to fill the silence. The best players, however, do something different. Nothing. They remain still. They stack their chips quietly, nod once, and continue. In that restraint they preserve their image. A calm reaction to being caught is itself a message. I'm not rattled. This is part of the plan. That calmness does more than protect perception. It rewires the mind. Every time you recover gracefully, you train yourself to see bluffing as a neutral event, not an emotional one. You start recognizing that a failed bluff isn't a personal failure. It's a statistical inevitability. Each execution builds resilience. Over time, you stop fearing the moment of exposure because you've lived through it before. You learn that your identity as a player isn't defined by one hand, but by how consistently you return to logic afterward. One quiet story illustrates this perfectly. A mid-stakes cash player once sat through a brutal night. Every continuation bet called, every semi-bluff raised. Late in the session, he fired a triple-barrel bluff with queen-jack on a king-high board. His opponent called with middle pair. Everyone at the table looked at him, waiting for a reaction. The player simply nodded, smiled faintly and said, "Nice call." Then he folded his cards, stacked his remaining chips, and went back to silence. 20 minutes later, he picked up aces and played the same line. His opponent, haunted by the earlier memory, folded top pair. The earlier failure became the foundation for the next success, not through manipulation, but through composure. This is emotional control in action, not suppression, but integration. The calm player doesn't avoid emotion, they understand it. They recognize that fear, pride, and frustration are part of the landscape. You can't bulldoze them, you must navigate them. Like waves on the ocean, they rise and fall. Your job is to stay steady enough that the current doesn't drag you under. There's also the matter of presence. Emotional control thrives on attention, the ability to stay in the current hand, not the last one or the next. When your focus scatters, emotion fills the gaps. Fear lives in the future. Regret lives in the past. Presence lives in neither. It lives in the breath, in the way you place your chips, in the rhythm of observation. The most centered players look like they're meditating between hands. They are, but it's an active meditation, one that anchors them in awareness while the table churns with noise. Some players develop rituals to reinforce this presence, stacking chips the same way before every hand, counting to 3 before acting, or sipping water after big pots. These routines aren't superstition, they're rhythm control. They remind the mind that nothing extraordinary is happening, even when stakes rise. The body follows rhythm, and rhythm keeps emotion contained. In the end, the mental game behind bluffing is about trust. Trust in your reasoning, your preparation, your restraint. When that trust falters, you reach for emotion as a substitute. When it holds, you move like water, calm, deliberate, unhurried. You no longer bluff to prove something, you bluff because it makes sense. The distinction seems small, but it's everything. True composure isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself. It's the quiet between decisions, the moment when your opponent looks into your eyes, searching for weakness and finds only stillness. That's when you realize emotional control isn't about appearing strong, it's about being unshaken by uncertainty. The cards no longer define you. The outcome no longer decides you, you're simply there, balanced between truth and silence. And that is where every great bluff begins. There comes a point when bluffing stops being about mechanics and starts becoming about perception, when every action, every pause and every glance becomes a brushstroke on a larger canvas of meaning. This is where deeper insight begins, the part of the game where awareness becomes intuition, where timing merges with logic, and where the line between truth and illusion fades into something quieter, more fluid. At the advanced level, bluffing is no longer a decision, it's a response. It flows from the structure you've built and the rhythm of your table presence. You aren't forcing stories anymore. You're listening for them. You're reading the table like a shared piece of music, aware of who's rushing the tempo, who's hesitating, and when silence might carry the most weight. In this space, a bluff doesn't feel like an act of defiance, it feels like alignment. The first layer of deeper insight is timing. Timing is not speed, though it's rhythm. A well-timed bluff feels as inevitable because it fits the pace of the hand. When you act too quickly, it feels defensive. When you act too slowly, it feels contrived. The perfect moment exists in the middle, calm, natural, deliberate. You move when the table expects stillness, and stay still when it expects motion. This rhythm creates unease in your opponent's perception. They can't anchor you, and uncertainty breeds folding. Consider a subtle example. You're in a deep-stacked game holding Queen 10 suited. You open from the hijack, the small blind calls. The flop comes Ace 7-4. You continuation bet small and your opponent calls. The turn brings a king, completing a board that heavily favours your perceived range. You check back, letting tension build. The river is a blank, 2 of diamonds. Your opponent leads small, a block bet designed to test you. You raise calmly, not quickly, representing the nuts with ease. You're not bluffing recklessly, you're playing the timing of the hand. Every street tells a story that makes your raise believable. That's what separates instinct from impulse. Instinct is trained intuition, the kind that emerges after thousands of hands, patterns, and quiet observations. It's when your mind no longer needs to consciously process every variable, because your experience already has. The best bluffers often say they felt it. What they really mean is that their subconscious recognized the perfect storm of rhythm, posture, and probability before their logic caught up. The next layer is combo awareness, understanding which hands exist within your range that can be turned into bluffs. This is not math for its own sake, it's clarity. When you know that you hold a hand blocking your opponent's strongest possible combinations, your confidence grows naturally. You're not hoping, you're reasoning. For example, if the board shows 3 hearts and you hold 1, you know your opponent is less likely to have the flush. That single detail transforms a risky move into a sound decision. Logic and intuition merge, and the bluff becomes clean. Deeper insight also means recognizing the psychological context of your opponent, their patterns of emotion, timing, and fatigue. Every player leaks energy differently. Some become hyper-aggressive after losing a big pot, others shrink into passivity. The advanced player doesn't just notice this, they store it quietly, waiting for the right intersection between opportunity and temperament. You don't attack players, you attack moments, but even deeper than psychology lies something quieter: empathy. The best bluffers can step outside themselves and feel what the opponent feels. They can imagine the fear of calling wrong, the mental tug-of-war between curiosity and self-preservation. They understand that most folds aren't made because of logic alone, they're made because of discomfort. When you can empathize with that discomfort, you can design your bluffs to live inside it, to gently push your opponent toward the relief through surrender. This is where bluffing becomes almost meditative. You start to see it as a mirror of human interaction. The same principles that govern a bluff, timing, awareness, silence, empathy, also govern persuasion, negotiation, and trust in life. A bluff works not because you hide the truth, but because you present a version of it your opponent finds easier to believe. You're not lying, you're guiding perception, and to do that skillfully you must first be at peace with your own. The deeper you go, the more you realize that bluffing is not an act of deception, it's an act of honesty through control. You're not pretending to be fearless, you're expressing composure under pressure. You're not showing power, you're revealing discipline. The quietest players at the table are often the most dangerous, not because they hide emotion, but because they understand it too well to be ruled by it. Let's look at one advanced hand that shows these nuances in motion. You're playing a deep cash game. You raise under the gun with King-Queen of Hearts. A thoughtful opponent calls from the cutoff. The flop comes 9-8-3 with 2 hearts. You bet small. They call. The turn is the Ace of Spades, a scare card for both. You check. They check back. The river brings the 2 of clubs, completing no draws. You pause. Think about what each of you represents. You have the missed flush draw, but also the pre-flop credibility of strong aces. They have many pairs and missed straight draws. Your King of Hearts blocks key combinations they might call with. You count to 3 in your mind, not to stall but to breathe, then slide a bet across the line about 2/3 of the pot. It's a story that fits perfectly. From their perspective, you could easily have Ace-King, Ace-Queen, or a slow-played set. They tank, looking for signs of fear, and find none. Finally, they fold. You don't celebrate. You simply gather the pot, aware that the hand was not a performance but a reflection of structure, timing, and self-understanding converging into one smooth decision. That's the level of bluffing where insight lives. The board, the body, and the breath align. You're not trying to impress anyone, not even yourself. You're just executing the truth that logic and rhythm have built together. At this level, the secret is not to think harder, but to think softer, to notice without effort, to trust the awareness that emerges after years of repetition. Because when bluffing becomes effortless, it's not because it got easier, it's because you stopped fighting your own uncertainty. Deeper insight into bluffing is really deeper insight into the mind. Once you stop fearing the unknown, you realize the opponent isn't across the hill, it's within you. The moment you master that, every bet, every pause, every sense becomes natural. And when you reach that point, bluffing stops being something you do. It becomes something you are. The room was quiet except for the soft shuffle of cards and the rhythmic hum of the dealer's voice. It was late, that strange hour when conversation fades and the only sounds left are the full flicks of chips and the slow exhale of thought. A man sat 2 seats from the button, hands folded neatly on the felt. He hadn't played a pot in almost an hour. His stack had dwindled slightly, but he didn't seem concerned. Every few hands he'd look at the clock, then back at the table as if waiting for something specific. When the dealer slid him a new hand, he lifted the corners just enough to see. 10 of hearts, 9 of hearts. A simple hand, nothing special but alive with potential. The action folded around. He raised softly, his motion measured, like he was still half lost in thought. The big blind called, a younger player with restless energy and a tower of chips that tilted slightly to one side. The flop came queen of clubs, 6 of hearts, 4 of spades. A dull board, disconnected, uninteresting. The young player tapped the felt. Check. The man bet small, barely a whisper of aggression. The chips clicked gently as they landed. The call came quickly, almost too quickly, like a reflex. The turn brought the king of hearts, a shimmer of possibility. He'd picked up a flush draw and an open-ended straight draw, a dozen ways to improve, but none complete yet. The big blind checked again, this time slower, thinking. The man's eyes lingered on the board a moment longer. He could check back, take the free card. But something in the air shifted. The younger player's stillness wasn't calm, it was tension. The man slid out a bet, larger this time. No words, no expression, just the soft glide of motion and the quiet click of intention. The young player leaned back, frowning. His eyes darted between the pot and the man across from him. After a long pause, he called again. The river fell. The 2 of diamonds, the heart draws missed. The straight draws missed. Nothing had come home. For a moment, neither player moved. The dealer's gaze flicked between them, waiting. The young player finally reached for chips, a probing bet, small, uncertain. It was the kind of bet that begged for safety, not confrontation. The man sat perfectly still. He looked down at his stack, then back at the board. He inhaled slowly through his nose, the kind of breath that measures thought rather than nerves. Then he reached out gently and placed a tower of chips into the pot, a raise, clean and deliberate, not hurried, not hesitant. The room grew quieter. Even the dealer stopped shifting in his chair. The young player's eyes narrowed. He looked at the board, at the chips, then at the man's face. Nothing. No flicker of pride, no tension in the jaw, just presence. A minute passed, then another. The young player sighed, muttered something no one caught, and folded. The man nodded slightly, gathered the pot, and stacked his chips in silence. He never showed his hand. Later, as the table broke for the night, someone asked him about it, whether he'd had the flush, the straight, or nothing at all. He smiled faintly. I had a story, he said, and left it at that. That's the essence of bluffing. It's not noise, not showmanship, not the rush of adrenaline. It's patience, it's timing, it's the quiet confidence to tell a story that sounds like truth, and to let the silence at the end be its proof. To understand bluffing deeply, you must see it unfold through a variety of hands, not as isolated tricks, but as expressions of logic, rhythm, and emotion. What follows is a guided sequence. 6 hands, each exploring a different angle of the bluff. Each one carries a distinct lesson: structure, timing, empathy, restraint, conviction, and peace. Take your time with each. Picture the table. Hear the faint hum of conversation, the slow cluster of chips, the flick of cards sliding across felt. Every hand is a meditation in decision-making, a study of truth disguised as risk. Hand 1, the bluff that builds itself. You're playing in a quiet $2 to $5 cash game. You've been tight, deliberate. Your image is clean. On the button, you pick up 8-6 of spades. The table folds to you, and you raise to $20. The small blind calls, the big blind folds. The flop comes 10-7-2 with 2 spades. The small blind checks. You continuation bet $25, a natural, balanced action. He calls. The turn brings the king of diamonds, a scare card. You sense the hesitation in his breathing. The small inhale through the nose, the eyes shifting downward. His range weakens here. You bet again $60 into $95. He pauses. Calls again. The river is the ace of clubs. You've missed your draw. The pot sits just over $200. He checks. You look at the board, 10-7-2 king ace. You take a slow breath and recognize how your story reads. You raised pre-flop, bet on the flop, continued on the turn, and now the river completes the perfect run out for an ace-high value line. You slide out $140, not desperate but firm. He studies you, looks down once and folds. You exhale quietly, not in relief but in rhythm. That's the kind of bluff that doesn't need courage, it only needs structure. Every step along the way built credibility. You didn't force belief, you earned it. Hand 2. The semi-bluff and the dance with probability. Later that night, you're dealt Queen-Jack of Hearts in the cutoff. A loose player raises from early position to $25. You call, everyone else folds. The flop comes 9-8-3 with one heart. You've got 2 overcards and a gut shot to the nuts. Your opponent bets $40. You raise to $120. It's not random aggression, it's calculation. Even when called, you have outs. Any 10 makes the straight, any heart could turn equity. He calls, his body's stiff. The turn is the 5 of hearts. Now you hold a flush draw to go with your straight draw. He checks. You could check back, but your previous raise gives you credibility. The board texture favours your story. You bet $180 into $285. He folds quickly. You drag the pot. That's not luck. That's probability meeting awareness. You didn't just bet because you wanted to win now. You bet because your draw carried weight. Semi-bluffing is where mathematics and psychology shake hands. It's not gambling, it's balance. Hand 3, the failed bluff that taught a lesson. In another session, you're in the small blind with King 9 offsuit. 4 players limp. You complete. The big blind checks. The flop comes Queen 10-3 rainbow. You check. It checks around. The turn brings the 7 of clubs. Still nothing. You sense weakness from everyone. You bet $20 into $25. 2 folds. The button calls. The river falls the 2 of spades. The board remains uncoordinated. You fire $45 into $65, telling the story of a slow-played queen. The button hesitates, then calls with pocket 10s, a set from the flop. You nod, smile lightly and muck. No reaction, no regret. Later, reviewing the hand, you all realize the flaw. Your story began too late. You didn't show interest on the flop. You tried to invent a narrative out of air. The architecture was missing. Failure like this isn't wasted. It reinforces truth. A good bluff must feel inevitable from the first chapter, not improvised in the last. Hand 4, the bluff of empathy. A few weeks later, a tournament. Mid-stages. You've built a reputation for caution. You pick up ace 5 suited on the button. The chip leader sits in the small blind, restless from the losing streak. The action folds to you. You raise. He calls. The flop comes 8-7-2 with 2 clubs. Well, he checks. You check back. The turn is the king of hearts. He checks again. You bet small, representing delayed strength. He calls. The river brings the 4 of diamonds. No draws complete. He checks for a 3rd time, shoulders slightly slumped. You sense exhaustion. His stack is still large, but his energy is frayed. He doesn't want another big decision. You slide out a firm bet, not loud, not fast. He stares at the pot for what feels like a full minute, then folds. You show nothing. That's an empathy bluff. You didn't exploit fear, you recognized fatigue. You didn't attack a player, and you soothed one. You offered him the relief of surrender, and he took it. The best bluffs often happen when you see not the cards, but the person. Hand 5, the bluff that waited, a deep stack cash game. You've been playing for hours, folding patiently. You're under the gun with pocket 8s. You open, 2 callers join. The flop comes ace queen 5. You check, it checks around. The turn is the jack of clubs. You check again. One opponent bets small, the other folds. You call, not for your hand, but for the story beginning to take shape. The river comes the 10 of spades. 4 to a straight on the board. You pause. You check one last time. Your opponent, uncertain, checks back. You show 8s and lose to ace 4. It looks like a simple hand, but the lesson is subtle. Your patience, your restraint, created a note in your opponent's memory. You didn't bluff when the board invited it. The next time you fire in a similar spot, he'll believe you. Sometimes the bluff that wins isn't the one you make now, it's the one you prepare 3 hours early. Hand 6, the bluff that defined stillness. The final hand in this sequence takes place deep in a tournament. You're 4 from the final table. Every decision now vibrates with weight. You're in the big blind with Jack 9 of spades. The chip leader opens from the cutoff. You defend. The flop comes King 7-5 with 1 spade. You check. He continuation bets. You call. The turn brings the Queen of spades. You check again, now holding a flush draw and a gut shot. He bets again, large, pressing his advantage. You pause. Your breathing stays even. You call once more. The river comes the 3 of clubs. You miss everything. You check for a 3rd time. He hesitates, then bets nearly all your stack, a move designed to end your run. You sit motionless. The crowd around the outer tables murmurs. Your pulse slows deliberately. You think back to the rhythm of the hand. His line tells a story of confidence, but his body disagrees. His fingers linger on his chips too long. His breath shortens before release. His silence feels forced. You look at the pot, then at him, then back at the dealer. You move all in. A check-raise bluff for your tournament life. The sound that follows is pure stillness. Seconds turn to minutes. Then fold. You don't smile, you don't move, you simply nod once, stack your chips and look down at the felt. That's not about boldness. That's about stillness. The perfect bluff doesn't erupt from courage. It grows out of calm. When everything inside you wants to tremble, and you don't, the table feels it. The silence becomes a force of its own. Across these hands, a pattern emerges. Bluffing is not one action. It's a relationship between logic and composure. Sometimes it builds naturally. Sometimes it fails with grace. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it whispers. But in every case, it follows one law. The truth inside the bluff must be stronger than the lie it tells. The truth that you are composed, thoughtful, aware. That truth radiates through every action, even when the cards say otherwise. And that's why great bluffs feel peaceful, not wild. Because they are. The quietest moments of conviction in a noisy game. Every decision at the poker table sits on the edge between logic and instinct. Both are essential, and both can betray you if you lean too far into either side. Bluffing, perhaps more than any other part of the game, lives exactly in that balance, where calculation meets feeling and where the math of possibility fuses with the pulse of awareness. Logic builds the framework. It gives you structure, pot odds, bet sizing, range construction, the credibility of your line. It's what allows you to say, this story makes sense. Without logic, you're gambling, pressing buttons without direction, hoping fear alone will make your opponent fold. But logic alone is cold. It knows how to calculate, but it doesn't know when to act. Instinct, on the other hand, comes from everything logic can't measure. Rhythm, intuition, subtle observation. It's that quiet voice that says, he's not strong here, or this is the moment. It's built not from luck, but from exposure, the thousands of micro-patterns you've absorbed over time without realizing it. Instinct is your subconscious adding its own equation to the problem. The mistake most players make is believing they have to choose. The truth is that logic and instinct don't compete, they cooperate. Logic is the map. Instinct is the compass. You can't navigate without both. Logic tells you the terrain. Instinct tells you when to move. Imagine you're in a hand where the board runs out Jack 7-3, Queen 2. You've bet all the way through, representing top pair or better. Your opponent calls on every street, then checks the river. The pot is large. You have 8-9 suited, a pure air. The math says you should bluff a certain percentage of the time here. The range analysis supports it, but something in the air feels off. You notice your opponent sitting still and too still, a call button already half pressed in their mind. They're breathing steady, unbothered. Logic says bluffing here is profitable. Instinct says it's not the moment. You check back. They turn over bottom pair, a hand that might have snapped you off. You didn't outthink them, you outfelt them, and that's the invisible half of the craft, knowing when to override theory because presence whispers otherwise. Now reverse the situation. You're deep in a tournament, holding ace-10 of clubs. The board shows king 9-3-4-2, you've bet the flop, check the turn, and the river feels neutral. The pot is decent, but the opponent has shown no aggression. Something tells you they're weak. Maybe they missed a draw. Logic, however, reminds you that the king-high board favours them. You breathe. You replay the action. Every check, every call, every pause. You recognise the story. They've been protecting middling pairs all night, playing safe. You trust both sides. Logic confirms that their range is capped. Instinct feels the crack in their armour. You bet half the pot. They sigh, look once more at their cards and fold. That's balance. Instinct built the opportunity, logic gave it direction. The best players don't see these two forces as opposites. They train both. They study the math not to replace intuition, but to refine it. They analyze hands so their gut becomes educated. Over time, instinct stops being random. It becomes patterned wisdom. When logic and instinct merge, bluffing feels different. It's quieter. You no longer ask, should I do this? You simply know. The decision arises naturally, without rush, without noise. You act, not from impulse, but from the deep harmony between structure and presence. A player once said, I make logical decisions until the logic runs out. Then I listen to the silence. That's the balance. Bluffing doesn't demand certainty, it demands harmony. Because in the end, poker is not about who knows more, it's about who knows themselves better. Logic sharpens your decisions, instinct humanizes them, and when both speak in unison, you stop thinking about bluffing as a move and start experiencing it as awareness itself. Calm, complete, and undeniable. The art of bluffing isn't truly tested in a single hand, it's tested over years. In the quiet accumulation of hours spent in dim rooms, the endless cycles of wins, losses, and waiting. Long-term discipline is what separates players who understand bluffing from those who merely attempt it. It's not about mastering one perfect move, it's about maintaining composure, logic, and self-awareness across thousands of repetitions. Every serious player eventually learns that poker isn't a game of short-term results, it's a meditation on variance. The same bluff that works today might fail tomorrow. The same opponent who folded under pressure last week might call instantly next time. You can't control those outcomes. What you can control is the steadiness with which you make each decision. Bluffing becomes sustainable only when it's part of a larger structure, a balanced routine of study, reflection, and emotional neutrality. Discipline in bluffing begins with patience. The hardest skill to develop isn't timing, it's waiting. You can't force credibility. You earn it through long stretches of restraint. Every fold, every quiet hand you let go, is a deposit into the bank of future believability. When you finally move chips into the pot, your history does half the work for you. The long-term player knows this instinctively. The bluff is built not in the hand itself, but in the hours of discipline that precede it. Study also plays its part. Reviewing your hands, noticing patterns, understanding which bluffs made sense and which were ego-driven. These small acts of reflection shape your growth. Over time, you begin to see your tendencies clearly. You notice where emotion sneaks in, where fear tightens your range, where pride overextends it. Awareness turns history into guidance. Without study, every bluff becomes an isolated event. With it, every bluff becomes data, refined into intuition. Bankroll management may not sound connected to bluffing, but it is. When you protect your bankroll, you protect your emotional bandwidth. A player who risks money they can't afford to lose cannot bluff clearly. Their decisions will always lean towards safety or desperation. The long-term professional removes that weight. Their chips are tools, not lifelines. This freedom allows bluffs to come from clarity, not survival. Consistency is another quiet teacher. The more you play within your system, disciplined, balanced, rational, the more your opponents begin to feel your reliability. And paradoxically, that reliability becomes your camouflage. Because you appear stellar, your occasional deviations are believed without question. Long-term discipline gives your future bluffs credibility before they even happen. It's also worth mentioning endurance, not physical, but mental. Poker is a game of repetition and patience. The mind tires before the body does. Fatigue dulls observation, breeds impatience, and invites poor bluffs made from frustration. Long-term players learn to manage this through routine. Rest, hydration, breaks, and awareness of their mental limits. A tired player bluffs for relief. A disciplined one bluffs for purpose. There's a humility to long-term mastery. You stop measuring yourself by results and start measuring yourself by execution. Did the bluff make sense? Did it fit the story? Did you act from clarity, not impulse? These become the metrics of success. You start to care less about who folded and more about whether you stayed aligned with your own logic. That's the quiet transformation, from outcome-driven to process-driven. Over years, this discipline evolves into something resembling wisdom. You see new players bluff from emotion, and remember that you used to do the same. You no longer crave the immediate thrill of forcing a fold, you prefer the deeper satisfaction of knowing you could. Bluffing becomes an option, not a necessity. The ego fades, the patience remains, and when the years pile up, when the rooms start to look the same and the chips blur into memory, you realize what this long-term discipline has really built. Not just a skill, but a way of thinking. The ability to act under pressure without losing composure, the capacity to trust process over panic. Because in poker, as in life, anyone can be bold for a night, but only discipline can make you fearless forever. The table is quiet now. The chips have settled. You've heard the stories, seen the examples, felt the rhythm of what it means to bluff not as a trick, but as a way of thinking. And beneath all the theory, timing, and psychology, one truth remains. Bluffing is never about pretending to be someone else. It's about knowing yourself so completely that you can move through uncertainty without losing balance. When people first learn poker, they think bluffing is lying. It looks that way on the surface, betting without a hand, representing something you don't hold. But over time, you come to see that it's the opposite. A true bluff isn't an act of deception. It's an act of self-alignment. You're not lying to the table. You're demonstrating your ability to stay composed inside a lie, to speak calmly inside chaos. You're proving that your emotions no longer control your story. That's what this whole game really is, a mirror. It reflects your mind, your temperament, your patterns. Every chip you move reveals something about how you deal with thunder, risk, how you handle fear, how you manage ego. You learn that your biggest opponent isn't the person across from you. It's the part of you that wants certainty. Bluffing forces you to confront that part directly, to make a decision without knowing the outcome, and to live with whatever follows. That's poker distilled to its essence. The deeper you study this, the more you realize how transferable it is beyond the table. Life constantly places us in situations where we must act without full information. Relationships, careers, choices that ripple years into the future. Each decision asks, can you trust your judgment even when you're unsure? That's bluffing. Every moment of courage, every quiet stand against fear, carries the same energy as pushing chips into the pot with nothing but belief in your reasoning. When you strip poker down to its bones, bluffing becomes a study of honesty. Can you stay honest about your own motivations? Can you recognize when you're bluffing out of logic versus when you're bluffing out of ego? Can you feel the difference between clarity and chaos within yourself before the chips even move? Those are the real questions, and they extend far beyond cards. The longer you play, the more you start to value the silence between hands, the waiting, the reflection. The moments where you look at the felt and see more than just a game. You see a practice in awareness. You see how control doesn't come from dominance, but from surrender. From realizing that you cannot control the cards, only the story you tell with them. And when you learn to tell that story calmly, the table begins to mirror your composure back at you. Opponents feel it. The room feels it. You feel it. There's a peace that comes when bluffing no longer feels like a gamble. You stop chasing validation from folds or fears. You begin to see that the real victory isn't in the pot. It's in the poise, the ability to act with precision regardless of outcome. To bluff well is to be free from needing things to go your way. You act because the logic is sound, not because you crave a result. That's true strength. Quiet, steady, invisible. Think back to that first hand you ever bluffed. The shaking hands, the pounding heart, the flood of adrenaline. That was your body meeting uncertainty for the first time. Over the years, that sensation dulls, not because the game loses meaning, but because you've grown. You've learned to breathe through it. The fear becomes familiar. The silence becomes your ally. You stop performing and start observing. You stop reacting and start guiding. In that evolution lies the deepest lesson of all. Bluffing teaches you how to trust yourself when nothing feels safe. It trains you to find stillness inside risk, to speak softly when noise surrounds you. That skill extends far beyond the poker room. It enters conversations, negotiations, moments of doubt in ordinary life. You start noticing how often people try to mask insecurity with noise, how often truth hides behind movement. And you recognize yourself in them, because you've played that hand before. If you listen closely, The poker table becomes a meditation hall disguised as a game. Every hand asks, can you stay aware? Can you stay patient? Can you move through uncertainty without forcing it to resolve too soon? Bluffing at its core is the art of being okay with not knowing. It's the embodiment of patience under fire. And when you reach that point, when you can sit in the tension and feel at peace, something shifts. You realize that the table no longer intimidates you. The game no longer defines you. The results no longer shake you. You've learned to trust logic, to respect instincts, and to quiet the noise within yourself. That's the lesson beneath it all. Bluffing was never just about making someone fold. It was about learning to remain still in the storm, to tell a story with clarity, to breathe through the unknown, and to act without fear. Because the calmest player isn't the one with the best cards. It's the one who understands that every hand, win or lose, is simply another chance to practice composure. The cards will change, the chips will move, the stories will repeat, but the stillness you build, that remains. And if you can carry that stillness beyond the table, then you've already mastered the greatest bluff of all, convincing the world you were never uncertain to begin with.